Tasmania Talks with Mike O'Loughlin, weekday mornings from 9.
Now, we've heard about countless Tasmanian businesses struggling to stay afloat since borders reopened and Omicron hit our state. More and more Tasmanians are limiting their movements in the community to avoid the virus and therefore limiting the amount they're spending with local businesses and eateries. So what impact is this having on our economy? The most recent CommSec State of the States report saw Tassie's economy take out the top spot once again for the 8th quarter in a row. But will this continue now COVID is well and truly settled in Tasmania? Let's find out. Economist Saul Eslake joins me live on the line now. Saul, good morning. Thanks for your time and Happy New Year, by the way.
And Happy New Year to you, Michael, though it's, we're into the second week of February.
I know, there you go. Look, First of all, talk us through the State of the States report.
Well, the State of the States report is something put out every 3 months by the share broking arm of the Commonwealth Bank, and as we've discussed before, what it really measures is most improved rather than best in class, because what it's based on is how each state or territory is performing on each of 8 different economic indicators relative to how that state or territory has performed on those indicators over the past decade, rather than by comparison with how the other 7 states and territories are doing on those indicators. So a state which has done well over the last 10 years but has slipped somewhat in the most recent year or two will tend to rank lower than a state that's done poorly over most of the last 10 years but has lifted its game in the last 2 or 3 years. And that, broadly speaking, describes Tasmania's position. You go back 5 to 10 years and Tasmania was really performing very poorly. We had a recession in 2011, 2012 when the rest of the country didn't. We had much higher unemployment and so forth. And so the bar over which Tasmania has to hurdle in order to rank well in this survey isn't as high as the bar, for example, for Western Australia, which was doing very well until about 4 or 5 years ago, but when its mining investment boom peaked and started to falter and people started leaving and house prices in Perth started falling, they had fallen away again, although Western Australia's picked up quite a bit in the last 2 years because the iron ore price has gone back over $100 and there's a lot of that stuff being dug up and shipped off to China in particular. So what this survey says again is that Tasmania's economic performance is considerably better than it had been on average over the past decade by a much bigger margin than most other states and territories, some of which, like Western Australia, the Northern Territory and Queensland, actually aren't doing as well as they had been over the previous decade on average. So, as I say, we're most improved, and that's to be celebrated, and the state government's entitled to claim a reasonable share of the credit.
Yeah,
that we're much improved.
If I can, Saul, I mean, while the figures look good, and you've touched on it there's always a little more we need to take into account, isn't that right?
Well, that's right. The CommSec report actually says quite explicitly towards the back that Western Australia is leading the nation on more indicators than any other state is. And that's not really surprising when you consider what drives Western Australia's economy. And we are simply the most improved. The other thing to note about the CommSec data is that much of what it's based on is now fairly dated. It's based, as I said, on 8 indicators. One of those, population, was for the 30th of June last year. Another 5 of them were for the September quarter last year. That's things like the volume of retail sales and dwelling commencements and investment by businesses in new plant and equipment and the like. 2 of them are for November, and the most recent one was the unemployment rate for December. And even then, Tasmania's unemployment rate dropped to 3.9% in December, so that ranked us fairly well. But the main reason the unemployment rate dropped was that people dropped out of the workforce rather than that because they found a whole lot more jobs. So, as I say, the message, which is a good message, is that Tasmania's economy is doing a lot better than it had been over most of the last 10 years, it doesn't mean we're actually the fastest growing economy in the country.
No, but as you've written, and in your report that I was reading, and I thought it was good reading, you said what the ComSec report is really awarding Tasmania on this occasion, as it has 7 times previously in the past 2 years, is not best in class, but rather most improved.
That's right. That's right, and
a better way to put it.
That's better than it being at the bottom of the pack, as we were 6, 7, 10 years ago. The other thing to note about it, of course, Mike, is that because we have been doing much better over the last 2 or 3 years, the height of the bar over which we have to jump in order to remain in first place is getting higher as well. Yeah. Whereas the bar over which, say, Western Australia has to jump, or Victoria has to jump, in order to improve its relative position, has been getting a bit easier. So, I suspect we will remain in top place for a good deal of this year as those surveys come out, but come 2023 or 2024, it'll be a bit tougher.
And 8 quarters, 2 years, about the same amount of time since the pandemic hit. Is that a coincidence?
By and large, yes, I think it is. We were helped a bit, I suppose, by the fact that with that infections were low here, and we managed to avoid, in particular, the lockouts that Victorians chose to impose on themselves. They were sort of lockdown happy by comparison with New South Wales.
Nicely put.
We managed to avoid that, and that certainly helped domestic economic activity. We don't really have any hard data on what has happened to the Tasmanian economy since the 15th of December, when the borders were opened and the Omicron virus spread more rapidly. As you said in the introduction, it seems fairly clear that a lot of locals have chosen to curb their movements, to stay at home because they're fearful of catching the virus, and a number of other businesses have had to scale back their operations because a large proportion of their workers have either been sick themselves or been close contacts of people who've been sick and so haven't been able to come to work. On the other hand, it would seem that in aggregate, though those sort of impacts have been offset by the fact that we have had mainland tourists coming here spending money. Now, that doesn't mean that individual businesses haven't been affected. If I can just talk Hobart for a minute, it's pretty clear that restaurant strip in North Hobart, in Elizabeth Street, North Hobart, which mainly caters to locals, a lot of businesses there have been really struggling. Yep. Hotels, restaurants and those sorts of things have been really struggling because that area mainly caters to Hobart locals. On the other hand, it would seem that businesses around the waterfront in Salamanca Place and so forth, who cater to a lot of tourists, they've had a different experience. And as I say, we don't have retail sales data or anything like that yet. What we do have is the data that's taken and published by the tech giants Google and Apple. And that data says that, yes, to a degree, Tasmanians have been staying home a bit more over the last 6 or 7 weeks than they did over the corresponding period in summer last year. But on average, people have been at workplaces, at retail and recreation places, in parks and in transit and that sort of thing. They've actually, in aggregate, been doing more of that than they did this time last year, and it hasn't fallen compared with the pre-Christmas period, the pre-15th of December period. It hasn't fallen as much as it has on the mainland. And that makes sense when you actually look at the figures for how many cases we've had. So, for example, up until last Friday, Tasmania had since the 1st of December 2.8 cases per 100 people. The national average was 9.6. Tasmania's figure was lower than any other state except Western Australia, which of course remains in isolation. The proportion of Tasmanian COVID cases who've ended up in hospital is 0.4%. Again, that compares with the national average of 0.8. In other words, half as many people who've got COVID in Tasmania have ended up in hospital as the national average. And the proportion of Tasmanians who have caught COVID since the borders were open is barely more than a quarter of the national average. So although opening the borders has obviously brought the virus to Tasmania or allowed it to come in, nonetheless, we have coped with that in Tasmania better than anywhere else except Western Australia, who of course can afford to sit in glorious isolation over there, swimming in their iron ore royalty revenues, which is not something we can do here in Tasmania.
That gets up your goat, I know how it does, Saul, and fair enough too, but I find it interesting, isn't it, that this report says nothing about how Tasmania's and the rest of Australia's economic performance is being affected by the spread of Omicron, the variant of COVID-19. I always wonder, why is that? I mean, for heaven's sakes, it's everywhere. Why don't they consider that?
Well, because they're relying on data that is, particularly in circumstances like this, out of date. So, the most recent data we have on anything from the Australian Bureau of Statistics is the employment figures for December. We'll get the January figures the Thursday after next. And I suspect they won't show a great deal because although lots of people haven't been able to go to work, I haven't heard or read anything about mass sackings or stand-downs in the way that we did during the great lockdown in the first 3 or 4 months after the pandemic, or as we read in New South Wales and Victoria when they had their lockdowns last year. There don't appear to be a lot of retrenchments going on, and so what I suspect the January figures will tell us is that average hours worked dropped quite a lot, but employment and unemployment probably won't have changed very much by comparison with December. It'll probably be when we get the retail sales numbers for January, which I don't think we get until the beginning of March, we will have some impact on what's happened in the retail sector.
Can I also get a comment from you in regard to something I read was very interesting, that you say Tasmania should raise taxes on mainlanders who buy up Tasmanian houses and price locals out of the market?
Yeah, let me be very specific about that, Mike, and thanks for the opportunity to do it. I don't in any way want to discourage mainlanders from moving to Tasmania. I think that's a good thing if they do, and I certainly wouldn't want to make it financially more difficult for anyone on the mainland who's thinking of making Tasmania their home to do that. What I was specifically suggesting was that mainlanders who buy properties here as investments, who in so doing drive up the price, because if they weren't prepared to pay a higher price than the local, they wouldn't be buying the property. Why shouldn't they pay a bit extra stamp duty or a bit extra land tax or both, in the same way that Tasmania, like other state governments, have in recent years imposed higher stamp duties and land taxes on foreign investors?
Yeah.
And, as I say, I certainly don't want to make Tasmanians pay higher taxes. I don't want to make mainlanders who are choosing to make Tasmania their home pay higher taxes. But if there are mainlanders who are just speculating on property prices here going up and who are in fact contributing to driving property prices up to the detriment of other Tasmanians who are desperately trying to buy a home for their own to live in, then why shouldn't they pay a bit more tax? It raises more revenue for the government, and from the government's point of view, the people who it's raising extra revenue from don't vote in Tasmanian elections, so there are no votes to be lost. I mean, you get opposition to this from the real estate industry. And
Property Council of Tasmania, they've said it's risky and destructive.
Well, yeah, of course they would say that, wouldn't they, as Mandy Rice-Davies famously said. I mean, the property industry, and in particular real estate agents, make their money from a percentage of the turnover in property. In other words, the more transactions there are at higher prices, the more money they make by way of commission. So, you can understand why they don't want anything that would result either in prices not going up as much or not as many transactions taking place here. And someone famously said it's hard to get a man to understand something when his salary depends on him not understanding it. And that's something I always think of when
That's a great quote.
People Right, when I see people from the real estate industry saying that anything that might stop prices going up as quickly or anything that might reduce the number of transactions would cause the end of civilization as we know it. What I would say is that we've got to stop regarding ever-increasing house prices as an unambiguous good thing. Rising house prices are great if you own a house, and a majority of Tasmanians do own at least one house. But for an increasing minority of Tasmanians, ever-rising house prices are a bad thing. It's making it harder for younger Tasmanians to buy their first home, and for those who will never be able to buy their home, it means rising rents at a time when incomes aren't rising.
You've said median rent rising to $521 per week, and also, Tasmanian house prices a breathtaking 28.7% increase for 2021 alone.
And there is a downside to this. I mean, as I say, it's great if you own a house. Although if you only own one house, in order to crystallise that increase in your paper wealth, you actually have to sell it. And then, of course, you have to buy another one. And so are you really better off? Yes, if you've got a slew of investment properties, you're obviously better off in much the same way as you are if the share market goes up. But there's a downside to this as well. And you never read about it in the media. All you read is, someone from the Real Estate Institute or the Property Institute, Property Council saying property prices have gone up in Tasmania faster than anywhere else. Yippee! And you don't want to do anything that stops that. This is, why real estate agents and others are great supporters of cash grants to first home buyers, even though we've got 60 years of history that says they don't work, that all they do is inflate the price of property by the amount of the grant, because real estate agents get a percentage of the increase in the value of a property when they sell it. That's why I call these things second home vendors grants, because that's actually where the money ends up, rather than in first home buyers.
Can I then comment on the Reserve Bank? How long are we just going to have no cash rate rises? It's got to happen eventually. And with that happening, surely then there'll be it'll start to plateau out.
I think you're right. And, of course, in many other countries where inflation is higher than it is in Australia, interest rates have started going up already. So, for example, last Thursday, the Bank of England put rates up for the second meeting in a row. The Reserve Bank of New Zealand has put rates up at its last two meetings, and it'll probably do it again when they meet on Thursday week, the 23rd of February. The US Federal Reserve has given a pretty clear signal that when they meet next time in early March, they'll be putting rates up for the first time, and that they'll probably be putting them up almost every meeting for the rest of this year and into 2023. All of those countries have higher inflation than we do. In the US, the inflation rate's 7.1, which is the highest since the 1980s. In New Zealand, it's 5.9. In the UK, it's 5.1. Here, it's 3.5. And some of that's a little artificial. The underlying inflation rate, which the Reserve Bank tries to keep it between 2 and 3%, is 2.6%. The Reserve Bank says it's not convinced that the inflation rate is sustainably within their 2 to 3% target band. I, personally think they're being a little timid about that. But the governor of the Reserve Bank made it pretty clear last week that interest rates are going to go up at some point, and the argument is really whether they start going up in the second half of this year or they start going up in the first half of next year. And when they do, as you say, the rate of property price inflation will slow down to some extent. I don't think rising rates will cause prices to fall, but I do think it and other factors will cause them to go up at a slower rate than they have been doing. And I, for one, would say that's a good thing.
Do you think, Saul, it's really been a business-led recovery? I know the Australian economy is business-led in regard to Josh Frydenberg's strategy, but do you really think, you look at Tasmania, is it a business-led recovery?
Oh, business has certainly been playing a role in Tasmania's recovery by employing more people and by investing in plant and equipment and new buildings and that sort of thing. That was one of the categories of the Commonwealth Bank's survey we were talking about before, where Tasmania was outpacing other states and territories. And one of the things that the state government can claim credit for in Tasmania's improved economic performance is that since coming to office, it has maintained the confidence of the business community here in Tasmania. So, that has certainly played a role, but consumer spending has played a big role too, and I think it will continue to do so because governments, federal and state, have thrown enormous amounts of cash at households over the last 2 years since the onset of the pandemic. In aggregate, Australian households have socked away an additional $240 billion in bank deposits since February 2020, and that money is going to be spent over the next 2 or 3 years in ways that will boost all sorts of businesses as well as the economy as a whole. And so I think we will have both a consumer and business-led recovery. What we may not have, that we've had for much of the last 20 years, is helpful contributions, tailwinds, if you like, from rising commodity prices and rising exports. I suspect they will be in, certainly mineral exports. I mean, agricultural exports, which are more important for Tasmania, may do quite well, but iron ore and coal in particular, which have been huge contributors to Australia's prosperity over the last 20 years, I suspect will be trending in the other direction over the next 5 years.
Speaking with Saul Eslake, our economist, with Tas Talks, what was opening the borders then you would say the right move?
Yeah, I would. I think, and I said at the time, it would have been an extraordinary breach of faith with the Tasmanian people who had been promised repeatedly that if more than 90% of us got vaccinated, we would be allowed out and mainlanders would be allowed in, that people would be able to renew connections with families, friends, loved ones and so forth. It would have been an extraordinary breach of faith, in my view, if the Premier had said, as the Western Australian Premier has done, sorry about that, we're going to keep you locked in for longer. And I know there are people who liked the idea of people being locked in when I said, in response to a reporter, that there were a disappointingly large number of what I called narrow-minded people writing letters to the editor of the paper about this. I wasn't referring, as some people thought, to those who argued the borders should remain closed. I mean, I disagree with that, but I don't say that someone's narrow-minded simply because they think that. What I meant by narrow-minded people was the ones who were criticising Tasmanians for travelling to the mainland when it was allowed to do so and found themselves caught on the wrong side of the drawbridge being pulled up again and, had to sleep in caravans while they were waiting to get on the Spirits or something like that. And people would write to the paper saying, you shouldn't have been travelling during a pandemic, as if somehow that was a kind of criminal offence. And I think we do have in Tasmania people who don't have connections with the mainland, don't have any family, don't need to go there for work. Easy for them to stay at home and not go anywhere and somehow think that is the way everybody else should live. It's a bit like I notice when I'm on the road in Tasmania here, we seem to have an above average proportion of people who think that because they want to drive at 20 k's below the speed limit, everybody else on the same road at the same time should have to as well, rather than allowing those people to pass them by pulling over to the side of the road at regular intervals. And it's people wanting to impose their own lifestyle and other choices on everybody else. And, I was never a great fan of border closures anyway. This is something that was a unique Australian contribution to pandemic management. If anyone knows the United States, can you imagine New York and New Jersey closing their borders to each other and stationing soldiers in the Lincoln and Holland tunnels or on George Washington Bridge? Yeah. Well, of course it couldn't happen, and it didn't happen anywhere else in the United States. And as far as I know, Canadian provinces, who are in most respects more similar to Australian states than American states, they didn't ban their citizens from travelling to other states. I found the idea that you needed a visa to come home from Tasmania, if you'd been to Melbourne or Sydney, and that you'd have to line up for up to half an hour outside in the cold in the middle of winter in order to have your visa processed by our version of Border Force. To me, to use a phrase I don't like very much, that seemed almost un-Australian. And I'm glad we're not doing that anymore, and I support the government's decision to do it. And, it may have been popular to keep the borders closed, that doesn't necessarily mean it was right. And, you look at Western Australia and they're getting Omicron cases anyway, as is New Zealand.
I think they're going to be in a world of hurt, Western Australia, when they open. Now, if you look back, and we're all experts in hindsight, let's face it, the border's opening on the 15th, the horse bolted, it's gone. So therefore, we're going to move forward, and I believe we are moving forward. It's just the way it has to be now, and we just must be prepared to live with that, however we live.
That's right. And the other thing, Michael, that is relevant about this is the Premier has said repeatedly that his decisions about managing the pandemic have, from day one, been based on medical advice. And the decision to open the borders on the 15th of December was, so he has said, based on the advice of Dr. Veitch and his team. And there's been no suggestion that Dr. Veitch gave different advice or that he's advised that the borders should have been reclosed. And if Dr. Veitch had actually been against that decision, I suspect we would have found out about it somehow. It would have been leaked that the government had acted contrary to medical advice. I don't believe they did. I think that the decision to open the borders was based on medical advice. So those who are criticising the decision are actually saying, we know better than Dr. Veitch and his public health team, that they want to impose their views. In some cases, like Rosalie Woodruff from the Greens, she's an epidemiologist, so I'm not saying she's talking nonsense, but a whole lot of other armchair critics who have no expertise in this area, any more than I do, are kind of saying, I know better than Dr. Veitch. And the Premier, who has acted on the advice of public health all through this, that somehow the Premier should have ignored Dr. Veitch's advice to open the borders on the 15th of December and kept
You sound like Facebook, Saul.
And the others locked in. Well, I hope not, because I'm not on Facebook, and one of the things that's actually gladdened my heart over the last week is the amount of money that Mark Zuckerberg has lost as a result of the collapse in his share price on, I think it was Wednesday last week. My heart's bleeding for him in the same way as it would bleed for Western Australians if the iron ore price dropped below $100.
Yep. Listen, Saul, we've run out of time, but I do appreciate your time this morning. It's always a pleasure to talk with you, and I look forward to having continuing chats over the next few weeks.
So do I, mate. Thanks very much for this start to the year.
Oh, good to talk to you. Our resident economist, Saul Eslake there. And with Tasmania Talks.
Tasmania Talks with Mike O'Loughlin, weekday mornings from 9.